Dad visits his dead daughter to say goodbye to her. Then the unexpected happened. Please follow our channel Storytime for more stories. You'll find the link in the description, and it's also pinned in the first comment. Grief reaction after the death of a child are similar to those after other losses, but they are often more intense and last longer. You may experience the following grief reactions: intense shock, confusion, disbelief, and denial, even if your child's death was expected. He was just busy finishing up his daughter's grave when he spotted a young child walking toward her. He had golden hair and deep gray eyes. He could not have been older than 7 years old. He gave him a big smile and rushed past him. His eyes grew wider when he spotted something that initially went over his head. Terrible news. Things were going swimmingly for the Sampson family until their whole worlds came crumbling down one day. Their daughter sadly lost her life in a terrible accident. She meant everything to them, and they were heartbroken. When Paul Sampson first heard the news, he did not want to believe that it was true. He was busy with his job when he received the terrible call. He knew that things would forever be altered from that moment on. High school sweethearts. His daughter was born while her parents were finishing college. The pair had been together since high school, and by that point, they were already engaged. After they both graduated from college, they had the wedding of their dreams. Their daughter, Sarah, was the flower girl, and they couldn't have been prouder of their beautiful girl. They had a good life. The years went by, and Sarah grew into an amazing 18-year-old woman. Her parents were proud of all of her accomplishments. She was a straight-A student and always helped around the house. Not only did they have a great daughter, but they also had a beautiful house with high-paying jobs. However, one day everything took a turn for the worst. What you need to know. To comprehend the boy at the cemetery story, we must first learn something about Sarah. She had always been the smartest student in her class. She had tried to be involved as much as possible and always did her best. Sarah had dabbled in everything she could get her hands on. Nevertheless, one evening, she'd say something to her parents that would astound them. Seeing it through. She returned home and said she needed to sign some organ donation documents from the hospital where she was volunteering. Her father explained, "We thought it was a nice gesture and encouraged her to do it." In keeping with her usual approach to everything that she did, Sarah saw the exercise through to the end and returned home with an organ donation card. Unfortunately, Rosa and Paul were eventually going to lose her. An accident. Paul was busy at work when he received the terrible news. His sweet daughter was in a car accident on her way home from school. She was on her way to the emergency room. Paul did not know what to do with the news as he has received it. He dropped what he was doing and rushed to the hospital. He would be speechless when he saw what he had uncovered. The news. Paul had just arrived at the emergency room when his daughter was pronounced dead. Paul wanted nothing more than to be by his daughter until she finally found peace. Time lost all of its meaning, and Rosa and Paul's lives were colorless. They were torn over the loss of their daughter until something happened that changed it all. Saying goodbye. It had been a few months since their daughter's funeral, and Paul made sure to visit his daughter's grave every single night after work to say hello. He knew that his daughter wouldn't want her parents to be consumed by sadness, so they tried everything in their power to adapt to their new normal. However, that month, something peculiar would catch Paul's interest. The young boy. Paul was walking back to his car when he spotted a young boy passing. He must have been around 6 years old, and he had light blonde hair with deep gray eyes. He gave Paul a smile as he walked past him. He initially shrugged it off, but as the days passed, he became aware of something. An interesting week. Paul ran into the same boy the following evening. The week would continue in the same manner before Paul decided he'd at least try to see what the boy was always at the cemetery at the same time of day. As the new week started, he decided to stay back after greeting the boy on his path back to his car. As always, he smiled, waved, and walked by him. By this time, he didn't leave. Going back, Paul shadowed the boy with his phone's camera recording, only to see him walk to Sarah's tombstone. He stood over it for some seconds before sitting down. The scene didn't make any sense to Paul, who stopped recording, but he couldn't think of why the boy was next to his daughter's grave. Thinking maybe he'd confused the tombstones, he decided to step in. Is he her friend? As Paul approached the boy, he considered the possibility of him being one of Sarah's friends, but noticed he was too young to have known his daughter on such a level. He made sure he could hear his approach so as not to startle him before saying hi again and asking him what he was doing at Sarah's grave. "What is he doing?" I asked him if he knew Sarah, and he said no. Paul said to a reporter from her town's local news. He also revealed something about the boy that had him tearing up for days. He'd been battling a rare heart condition. After Sarah passed away, he received a heart through a transplant which saved his life. However, why was he visiting Sarah's grave every evening if he'd never met her? "Where's your mom?" Paul asked. Meeting his mom. He learned from his mom about Sarah and what she'd done for him. And the past 2 weeks, he had been asking his mom to drive him to the cemetery to talk to Sarah about his healing process. Paul shared amid happy tears. The little boy's mother was awaiting for him at the parking lot. That is when Paul approached her and learned that all the little boy and his family had been through. A rare heart condition. Little Tom had been born with a rare heart condition called unbalanced atrioventricular canal defect. This heart defect allowed blood to move freely through the 4 chambers of his heart, causing problems with his heart and lungs. A normal heart has separate chambers to keep the blood from the lungs from mixing with other blood from the rest of the body. By the time Tom was 2, he'd already undergone 4 open-heart surgeries. Getting worse. Although the surgeries seemed to help and Tom was able to relive a relatively normal life for a few years, things changed when he turned 6. Although he had been on the heart transplant list since he was 3, no viable hearts had been donated. Tom's condition continued to worsen. His mom, Laura, was beginning to lose hope. A slow process. According to the American Heart Association, the average wait for a heart transplant depends on several factors. However, it's hardly ever a quick process. Tom had to wait for 4 years, which is longer than most. When he was 6, his heart began to fail. He was hospitalized and had to stay there until a heart became available. A shortage of organs. With a serious shortage of donated organs, some people wait years to receive a heart transplant. In fact, around 3,500 Americans are on the heart transplant waiting list at any given time, and they are usually critically ill or die by the time the one becomes available. Tom was deteriorating right in front of his family's eyes, but all they could do was pray and wait. His case was particularly difficult because they had to wait for a heart that was the perfect size and blood type. Laura will never forget the day she got the news. Good news. His primary doctor came up and told me he had a transplant, Laura said in an interview. I think that was the biggest shock for me, like, wow, she added. It almost was so surreal. Tom was admitted for surgery the very next day. Meanwhile, Rosa and Paul had just received the news about their daughter, and their lives were falling apart. A success. As I watched his chest rise, my heart got heavy. God bless the family who chose to donate this precious gift of life to my baby boy, Laura wrote on Facebook. Thankfully, Tom's surgery was a success. Laura immediately saw a difference in his condition when he was wheeled out of the operating room. She couldn't believe her eyes. A change of heart. Before going in for the heart transplant, Laura had noticed that her son's skin had been a blue-gray color as a result of not receiving enough oxygenated blood. When he was returned from the operating room, Jane immediately noticed the color of his skin. My first reaction was his color, Laura recalled. When I looked at him, his color was amazing. Grateful. Soon after he was revived, Tom's breathing improved and his oxygen rose up to normal levels, all thanks to Sarah's heart. We will forever be grateful for the selfless act, for the family who saved our son's life, Laura said. Always have faith, because miracles do happen. In fact, Laura made it her mission to find out who had donated their heart to their son. Her heart broke for them. Laura found out who had donated their organs through a nonprofit organization, the United Network of Organ Sharing. Days after the transplant, she found Sarah's obituary in the local paper and read her funeral announcement. She learned all about the young woman and how giving she had been in life until she was suddenly snuffed out forever. Her heart broke for the McCrae family. She wanted to do something. Waiting for the right moment. Laura had been waiting for the right moment to contact the Sampson family to express her gratitude for their daughter's final selfless act, but she didn't want to approach them so soon after their loss. In the meantime, she told Tom about the girl whose heart he had, and he insisted on visiting her at the cemetery. Finding the plot number wasn't hard, but now she was face to face with Sarah's father. Emotional. Paul listened to Laura's story and felt a wave of emotion hit him. After months, the pain of losing his daughter was not as sharp. Now, it felt like a dull, heavy ache he carried with him everywhere. Everything reminded him of Sarah. Now, the little boy standing in front of him was literally carrying a piece of her and keeping it alive. He didn't know how to feel. A piece of her. Grief comes in waves. Paul had been holding it together that day for the first time in months, but suddenly the wave crashed over him, threatening to completely engulf him. Sarah's beautiful heart had been a perfect match for Tom. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't be here. Paul, who had been completely silent until now, asked a question. The question. Paul couldn't quite wrap his head around the situation. The sudden loss had been so hard to accept in the first place. Now he knew Sarah was, in a sense, still with him. "May I hear it?" Paul asked through the tears. "May I listen to her heart?" Tom nodded, so he knelt down and placed his ear against his little chest. He closed his eyes. Listening to her heart. And there it was, the quick, strong thud, thud, thud of Sarah's heart. Paul lost himself in its rhythm. He let it soothe his searing pain like a cool balm. For the first time in months, he had a sense that everything would be okay. She loved to share, so part of her life, and giving some of it to Tom and other children is part of who she was, he said, smiling. Pieces of her. Paul contacted the TV show, sharing to learn who had received Sarah's other organs. It turned out that his daughter had saved 8 other lives with her organs the day she died. 2 people had her lungs, another had her liver, and others had various other vital pieces of her. The Sampson met all of them, but they felt closest to Tom, the little boy who had her heart. That's our Sarah. Paul and Rosa had forgotten that their daughter had signed up to be an organ donor before passing and couldn't believe she'd saved so many lives. "It's truly the circle of life in its rawest form," Paul said. "She could never let a soul suffer if she could do something about it. That's our Sarah." But Paul and Rosa weren't the only ones who had recently experienced a loss. Pete Richford was visiting the grave of his loved one when he noticed an unexpected visitor. It was a dog, and nobody knew why it refused to leave the gravesite. A sad afternoon. He stood against the growing breeze, watching as thick storm clouds gathered above the cemetery. He wiped his tears and sniffled, saying goodbye before the rain caught him on the open field. He turned to leave, but heard a dog whine somewhere among the many tombstones. Against his better judgment, he moved to investigate. What he found made him freeze in place. Living life. Dan was a young lecturer from North Carolina. At 32, he'd achieved everything he'd set out to do in his life. He had a great job, a perfect romantic life, and friends that supported him through everything he did. But despite his achievements, Dan had done something that most people his age rarely did. Close to home. Although Dan had made some really impressive steps in his life, he still lived next to his childhood home. A native of the town where he lived, Dan had the most beautiful relationship with his dad. He'd grown up without a mom, with his dad taking on the role of mother and father. Now that he was grown up, he couldn't picture a life away from his old man, but that was about to change. The call. It was a freezing night when Dan got a call from his dad, who'd been sick throughout the year. Although he sounded stronger on the call, something within Dan screamed at him to cross the street to check on him. But Dan didn't. Choosing instead to hold the conversation over the phone, they talked for hours, his dad telling him how proud he was of him. Then Dan returned to sleep unaware of what was about to happen. Another call in the morning. Dan's next call was from his dad's caretaker in the morning, informing him she'd found his dad unresponsive. The hospital had declared him dead on arrival. Dan couldn't believe it. He was numb throughout the day, and as the weeks rolled by, all he could think about was how he spent his last moments with him on the phone instead of going to him. He had no idea what fate had in store for his future. Guilt. Guilt and missing his dad glued Dan to his dad's grave. He thought the first few weeks after his passing were hard, but the months that followed were grueling. Dan was talking to his dad that fateful afternoon when he noticed a storm rolling in. He wiped his wet eyes and got ready to leave, and that's when he heard it. Hearing the whine. The sound was a low whine which Dan immediately knew was coming from a dog. He cast his eyes around the cemetery searching for the animal. The dog whined again, and Dan began looking around the tombstones. He knew many dogs loved spending time with their late owners. He couldn't let such a poor creature be caught in the brewing storm. A storm is coming. A raindrop fell on his forehead as he hurried about, telling him he had to search faster. "Where are you?" Dan called out, frustration welling within him. He felt compelled to at least shelter the dog from the rain. Maybe it would be a good start for not being there for his dad. To feel the terrible absence and the attendant emotions, to feel out so control as times of unbearable. There is an understandable wish to bury all these feelings. Unfortunately, the pain then is only sublimated and becomes the source of other debilitating dysfunctions. While denial is a normal, necessary stage of healing, there is a balance between denial and interrupting the grief process. To give yourself permission to feel the emotions that the death of a child brings is an act of strength and courage that is almost unmatched in human behavior. A strong spiritual life is a powerful aid to the healing process, but a cautionary focus needs to be understood. Often parents, family, clergy, and loved ones, in an attempt to lessen the pain, will use, "Oh, God wanted the child," or "The child is with God so you don't have to grieve," or "God has a reason," or "God never gives us more than we can bear," to discount the suffering. Bottom line is, nothing nor no one can minimize the death of a child. Gathering together in love and support, validating and living through the agony with the parents and siblings is the only support we can offer. Hanging in there for the long haul, not just a couple of weeks or months, not even for just a year, staying connected and supportive for as long as it takes, is what is required of this most terrible loss.